The sun in the territory was not a gentle thing. It was a hammer, beating down on the cracked red earth until the heat shimmered in waves, distorting the horizon into a drunken wobble. This was a land that gave nothing for free and took what it pleased. It took the water from the creeks, leaving behind bony, white stone beds. It took the life from the plains, leaving the skeletal remains of sagebrush and the hide-bound carcasses of coyotes, too slow or too foolish to find shade. It was a land of jagged rock and endless sky, a place that could carve a man down to his essentials or break him entirely. The people who clung to life here were much the same. Their souls were often as parched as the creek beds, their kindness as rare as a summer rain. Trust was a currency scarcer than gold, and a man's life could be worth less than the water in his canteen. They were a hard people for a hard land, their faces weathered by sun and suspicion. In a small cabin nestled in a shallow valley, miles from the nearest dusty outpost they called a town, lived May. At 29, she wore the land on her face and in her heart. Her hair, the color of dark honey, was usually tied back in a severe knot, but strands always escaped to whip across a face that had forgotten how to hold a soft expression. Her eyes, a startling green like moss in a shaded spring, held the flat, watchful look of a creature that has learned to survive by seeing trouble long before it arrives. May was a widow, the Black Creek widow. They called her in town, though never to her face. The name was a brand, marking her as something apart, something tainted by tragedy and stubbornness. Her husband, Elias, had been a good man, a prospector with hands as big as shovels and a laugh that could make the cabin timbers hum. He'd seen a future in the glint of gold in the creek and the rich soil of their small plot. But others had seen it too. Land speculators from the east, men with soft hands and hard eyes who used signed papers and hired guns as their tools. There was a dispute, a heated argument that echoed down the canyon, and then a single, final gunshot. They'd left Elias lying face down in the creek that had promised him everything, his blood turning the water a muddy, sickening rust. That was 2 years ago. 2 years of a silence so profound it felt like a constant ringing in her ears. May had buried him herself, piling stones over the grave to keep the scavengers away, her tears mixing with the red dust. And in that moment, she had buried a part of herself with him. She had made a vow over that rocky mound. No more men, no more hope, no more of the vulnerability that love required. Love, she had learned, was just a prelude to loss. So she worked until her muscles screamed and her hands were a geography of calluses and scars. She took up Elias's rifle, its weight familiar and comforting against her shoulder, and learned to hunt with a patience and skill that would have shamed many men in town. She learned the subtle shift of a deer's ear, the exact moment to pull the trigger so the animal dropped clean. She tended her small garden, coaxing beans and corn from the stubborn soil, hauling water bucket by agonizing bucket from the well. She mended the fences Elias had built, her hammer strikes echoing his, a lonely rhythm in the vast emptiness. Her life was a fortress built of routine and exhaustion. It kept the grief at bay, most of the time, but the loneliness was a patient predator, stalking the edges of her consciousness, pouncing in the dead of night when the only sound was the wind whispering through the pines like a mournful ghost. The townsfolk left her mostly to herself, which was how she preferred it. When she rode in for supplies every few months, her face set like stone, they gave her a wide berth. The men looked at her with a mixture of pity and a coarse, unspoken curiosity. The women whispered behind their hands, their words like stinging nettles. "Too wild," they'd say. "Lives out there all alone. It ain't natural." They called her the woman no one dares to marry, partly because of the bad luck that seemed to cling to her like burrs, and partly because of the sharp, unyielding strength in her eyes that made lesser men feel small. She was an anomaly, a woman who did not remarry, who did not wither, who did not seek the protection of a man. In their world, that was a quiet rebellion, and they didn't know what to do with it. She had her own troubles beyond gossip. Twice. She'd chased off drifters looking for an easy meal or something more. The sight of her leveling the heavy rifle at their chests enough to send them scrambling. The land itself was a constant adversary. Drought, blizzard, the mountain lion that had taken one of her goats. It was a relentless siege. But May endured. She bent, but she did not break. The fortress held. Until the day the sky turned orange. It began as a scent on the wind, a smell of pine and something else, something acrid and ancient. May paused, her hand on the axe handle, and sniffed the air. Her gaze swept to the western ridge. A smudge of brownish-gray smoke stained the pristine blue, like a dirty thumbprint on a painting. Forest fire, common enough in the dry season, but this one felt different. The wind was gusty and unpredictable, blowing from the west, straight towards her valley. Throughout the afternoon, the smudge grew into a billowing cloud, the base of it glowing with a malevolent, pulsing light. The air grew thick and hazy, and a fine layer of ash began to settle on everything, a gray snow of destruction. The birds fell silent. The very air seemed to hold its breath. Panic, a cold and unfamiliar serpent, began to uncoil in May's stomach. She worked with a feverish intensity, her mind a whirlwind of frantic calculations. She soaked blankets in the water trough and draped them over the cabin roof. She herded her 2 goats and a handful of chickens into the small, sturdy root cellar dug into the hillside, hoping the earth would protect them. The horse, Daisy, was her biggest concern. She couldn't trap the animal. It was a death sentence. With trembling hands, she threw a saddle on the mare, her mind racing. Flee! But where? The fire was coming from the west, the main trail to town. To the east lay a maze of rocky canyons and impassable ridges. The sun, now a blood-red disk behind the smoke, began to sink. The fire was no longer a distant threat. It was a living thing, a monster of heat and hunger, and it was descending the ridge into her valley. She could hear it now, a low, constant roar like a monstrous waterfall, punctuated by the sharp crack and pop of exploding trees. The heat rolled towards her in palpable waves. May grabbed a small satchel, stuffing it with a tin of jerky, a water skin, and the small, tin-type photograph of Elias, his smile impossibly young and hopeful. It was all she could think to save. She ran to the corral, her lungs burning with smoke, and threw open the gate. "Go, Daisy! Go on, girl!" she yelled, slapping the mare's rump. The terrified animal bolted, disappearing into the smoky twilight. May stood for a moment, paralyzed by the sheer, overwhelming power of the approaching inferno. Flames, hundreds of feet high, licked the sky. The cabin, her fortress, her entire world, was about to be devoured. A sob, hot and ragged, tore from her throat. She turned to run, to scramble up the rocky slopes behind the cabin, but her foot caught on an exposed root and she went down hard, her head striking a stone. Dazed, her vision swimming, she pushed herself up, the roar of the fire filling her ears, drowning out all thought. This was it. This was the end. The land was finally taking the last thing she had. And then, through the smoke and the chaos, she heard another sound, the thunder of hooves, fast and desperate. A shape materialized from the swirling embers, a rider on a powerful black stallion, a silhouette against the hellish glow. The horse reared as it reached her, its eyes wide with terror, but the rider held it steady with an iron grip. He swung down from the saddle in one fluid motion. "No time for that, ma'am!" A deep voice cut through the roar. He was a young man, no more than 25, with shoulders that strained the fabric of his dusty shirt. His face was weathered by the sun, his jaw set with determination, but his eyes, the color of a clear sky, were startlingly calm in the midst of the apocalypse. Without a word, he scooped her up as if she weighed nothing. May, disoriented and overwhelmed, found herself thrown across the front of his saddle. He vaulted up behind her, his arm a band of steel around her waist, and spurred the horse, "Hold on!" he yelled, and they plunged into the smoke. They rode not away from the fire, but parallel to it, skirting the edge of the inferno. The heat was a physical blow, searing her skin. Embers rained down around them, small dying stars. The stallion was magnificent, a creature of pure power and instinct, leaping fallen logs and navigating the treacherous terrain under the man's expert guidance. May buried her face against his chest, the rough cotton of his shirt smelling of sweat, leather, and smoke. She could feel the solid, steady beat of his heart against her cheek, a rhythm of life in a world of death. He guided the horse towards a sheer rock face, a dark gash in the stone she'd never noticed before. It was the mouth of a cave. He reined the horse to a halt, slid from the saddle, and lifted her down. Her legs were weak and trembling, and she stumbled against him. "In here! It's our only chance," he said, his voice low and urgent. He slapped the stallion's flank. "Go, boy! Find low ground!" The horse, free of its burden, galloped away into the smoky darkness. The man pushed her gently but firmly into the cave, following close behind. The cave was shallow, not much more than a deep overhang, but the solid rock offered a shield against the blistering heat. They huddled at the back, watching the world burn. The fire raged past the mouth of the cave, a roaring river of destruction. The sound was deafening, the light blinding. It was a vision of hell itself. May pressed herself against the cold stone, shaking uncontrollably. Not just from fear, but from the shock of it all. The loss of her home, her fortress, laid bare and vulnerable in a matter of hours. As the main front of the fire passed, the roar subsided into a crackling, hissing aftermath. The world outside the cave was a landscape of glowing reds and oranges, the skeletons of trees silhouetted against a smoke-choked sky. The immediate danger was over, but a new one presented itself. The night air, stripped of its warmth by the fire's updraft, grew intensely cold. The wind howled through the burnt-out valley, a mournful, chilling cry. May's teeth began to chatter, the thin fabric of her dress offering little protection. She wrapped her arms around herself, but the cold was seeping into her bones. Her rescuer, who had been standing guard at the cave mouth, turned and saw her shivering. He moved to her side. For a moment, he hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty in his clear eyes. Then, with a quiet resolve, he sat down beside her, his back against the rock, and pulled her against his side. "Forgive me, ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble. "But it's either this or we freeze." His arm came around her shoulders, pulling her firmly against the solid warmth of his body. The contact was a jolt, a shock to a system that had been starved of human touch for 2 long years. Her first instinct was to pull away, to recoil into the safety of her isolation. But the cold was biting, and his warmth was a tangible, undeniable comfort. She could feel the strength in his chest and shoulders, the steady rise and fall of his breathing. Slowly, hesitantly, she allowed herself to lean into him, to accept the shelter he offered. They sat in silence for a long time, listening to the wind and the dying crackle of the fire. The shared warmth began to push back the cold, creating a small pocket of survival in the vast, desolate night. "My name's Caleb," he said finally, his voice soft. "May," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the smoke. "My cabin. Everything." "I'm sorry," he said simply. There was no pity in his voice, only a quiet understanding that resonated more deeply than any empty platitude. "Saw the smoke from my camp over the ridge. Figured someone might need a hand." "You saved my life," she said, the words feeling inadequate. He just grunted in response, a sound that dismissed her gratitude, in the faint, eerie glow from the smoldering landscape. She could see his profile. It was a strong face, not handsome in a refined way, but rugged and honest, a face that had seen its share of hardship. "What's a woman like you doing living out here alone?" he asked, his tone gentle, curious. The question pierced her carefully constructed armor. The story, the one she never told, rose to her lips. Perhaps it was the smoke, or the shock, or the simple, disarming warmth of the man beside her. But she found herself speaking. "My husband," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "Elias, we built that cabin together. He was killed 2 years ago. Over the claim—" She didn't need to say more. In this land, that short, brutal summary was a complete story. Caleb was silent for a moment, his arm tightening almost imperceptibly around her. "I'm sorry to hear that," he said again. And again, she believed him. "There's too much greed in this world." "And you, Caleb?" she asked, wanting to deflect the attention from her own raw wounds. "What brings you to this part of the country?" He shifted slightly, his body a solid wall of heat against her. "Fought some in the war, rode for wages for a cattle outfit down in Texas for a while. A hired gun, when I had to be, but I'm done with that life. Saved up enough to find a piece of land of my own." "Settle down," he paused, and his next words were quieter, almost reluctant. "Got a mail-order bride coming from back east. Lydia's her name. Supposed to be in town in a week or 2. The words landed like stones in the quiet cave. A bride, of course. A man like this, strong, capable, decent, would not be alone for long. A cold knot formed in May's stomach, a feeling she couldn't name and didn't want to. It felt like disappointment, sharp and bitter. And with it came a wave of shame. What right did she have to feel anything at all? The intimacy of their position suddenly felt wrong, dangerous. She was huddled against an engaged man, a stranger, drawing life from his warmth while her own world lay in ashes. It felt like a betrayal, to Elias's memory, to the vow she had made on his grave, and even to this unknown woman, Lydia, who was traveling thousands of miles with her heart full of hope. The wall she had built around her heart, momentarily breached by fire and fear, slammed back into place, stronger and colder than before. She was the Black Creek widow, a woman alone. That was her identity, her penance. With a sudden, sharp movement, May pushed herself away from him, scrambling to the other side of the small cave. The cold air rushed into the space between them, and she shivered. But this time it was a chill that came from within. "What is it?" Caleb asked, his voice laced with confusion. He started to reach for her, then let his hand fall. "Don't!" she said, her voice sharp. "We shouldn't—" He looked at her, his brow furrowed. "I was just trying to keep you warm, ma'am." "I know," she said, her voice trembling with an emotion she couldn't control. She wrapped her arms around her knees, making herself small. I can't. It's not right." "Foolish woman," she chided herself, letting her guard down for a moment of comfort, forgetting who she was, forgetting Elias. The memory of his face, his laugh, flooded her, and the grief was so sharp, so sudden, it was like a physical blow. Caleb watched her for a long, silent moment. The understanding in his eyes was replaced by a different look, one of regret and a deep, quiet sadness. He didn't press her. He simply gave a slow nod and turned to face the cave entrance again, leaving her to her cold and her ghosts. The rest of the night passed in a strained, heavy silence. May did not sleep. She watched the embers outside fade to black and listened to the mournful wind, feeling more alone than she had in 2 years. When the first gray light of dawn crept into the valley, it revealed a scene of utter devastation. The ground was blackened and smoking. The proud pines were now just charred spires pointing to a gray sky. It was a dead world. Caleb rose stiffly and went to the mouth of the cave, scanning the landscape. "I see your horse," he called out. "Daisy. She's down by the creek bed. Looks all right." A small sliver of relief cut through May's despair. He helped her out of the cave, his touch impersonal and brief. They made their way down the slope, their boots sinking into the soft ash. The cabin was gone. Only the stone chimney remained, a lonely monument to a life that no longer existed. May stared at the ruins, her face a blank mask, the tears frozen behind her eyes. There was nothing left to cry for. Caleb caught Daisy, his movements calm and reassuring to the spooked animal. He led the horse to May. "I'll take you into town," he said. It wasn't a question. The ride was silent. May sat behind him on her own horse, her hands gripping the saddle horn. She could feel the warmth radiating from his back, a warmth she had rejected, and she kept a careful distance between them. When they reached the outskirts of the town, he reined in his horse, which he had found grazing nearby, miraculously unharmed. He looked at her, and his clear eyes were full of something she couldn't decipher. It was more than pity. It was a deep, unsettling concern, a connection forged in fire and darkness that neither of them had asked for. "You'll be all right, ma'am?" he asked. May lifted her chin, the familiar mask of stoic indifference sliding back into place. "I'll be fine," she said, her voice flat. He held her gaze for a moment longer, as if he wanted to say something more, as if he were searching for a crack in the fortress she had rebuilt around herself. But he found none. With another slow nod, he turned his horse and rode away, not looking back. May watched him go, a straight, solitary figure receding into the distance. She watched until he was just a speck, and then she turned her horse towards the town, towards the whispers and the pitying looks. She was alone again, but as she rode, a new and terrifying feeling echoed in the hollow space where her heart used to be. It was the faint, unwelcome flutter of life, a feeling she had sworn to never feel again. The stagecoach arrived in a cloud of its own making, the fine red dust settling slowly on the tired horses and the sweat-stained leather. From its cramped interior emerged Lydia, a figure as out of place in the harsh glare of the western sun as a porcelain doll in a blacksmith's shop. At 22, she possessed a delicate, fine-boned beauty that seemed ill-suited to this rugged land. Her dress, a simple gray traveling frock, was impeccably clean despite the long journey, and her hands, though calloused from a life of labor, were folded gracefully over a small reticule. But beneath the gentle exterior, her pale blue eyes held a steady, observant light, the look of a person who had weathered storms, albeit of a different kind. She carried with her a single, battered trunk that held all her worldly possessions. Tucked safely in her reticule was a small packet of letters, tied with a blue ribbon. The handwriting was a neat, maternal script, but the words were purported to be from the man she had traveled 2,000 miles to marry, Caleb. They spoke of good land, a strong house, and the promise of a life where the sky was not choked with factory smoke, and a woman's future was not dictated by the shrill scream of a weaving loom. For Lydia, these letters were a testament of hope, a ticket out of the grinding poverty of the industrial East, where she had been born and where she had intended not to die. Caleb was waiting for her on the boardwalk in front of the general store. He was taller than she had imagined, broader in the shoulder. He looked clean and handsome in a fresh shirt, his face scrubbed, his hair damp and neatly combed. But as she drew closer, she saw the tension in his jaw and the way his gaze seemed to skim past her, never quite settling. When he took her hand, his touch was brief and overly gentle, as if he were handling something fragile that he feared he might break. "Miss Lydia," he said, his voice lower than she'd expected. "Welcome. I trust your journey was tolerable." "It was long, Mr. Caleb, but the thought of my destination made it bearable," she replied, offering a small, hopeful smile. A flicker of something, guilt, perhaps, or regret, passed through his clear eyes before he looked away. "Right. Well, let me get your trunk. I've arranged a room for you at Mrs. Gable's boarding house until we can speak to the preacher." His hesitation was a tiny crack in the smooth facade of their arrangement. Lydia noted it but said nothing. She was a practical woman. She knew a man and a woman who had never met could not be expected to fall into an easy intimacy. Awkwardness was to be expected. Still, a small knot of unease began to form in her stomach. He carried her trunk with ease, and they walked the short distance to the boarding house. He pointed out the town's few landmarks: the saloon, the assayer's office, the new church with its half-finished steeple, but his words were mechanical, the speech of a guide, not a future husband. Lydia tried to bridge the distance between them. "Your letter spoke so beautifully of the mountains," she said, her voice soft. "Your mother has a wonderful way with words." Caleb's stride faltered for a half step. "My mother?" "The handwriting," Lydia clarified gently. "It is a woman's hand. I presumed it was her, writing on your behalf." He flushed, a dark red creeping up his neck. "Yes, that's right. I'm not much for words on paper." He fell silent again, and the silence stretched, growing heavier with each step. He seemed to be carrying not just her trunk, but the weight of something unspoken, a burden that bowed his strong shoulders. He deposited her and her belongings at the boarding house with a palpable sense of relief, promising to call on her for supper that evening. As he walked away, Lydia watched from the window. He paused at the end of the street, and his gaze lifted, not back towards her, but west, towards the jagged, smoke-stained line of the hills. The welcome gathering was held 2 nights later in the church hall. The women of the town, starved for novelty, had organized it with bustling efficiency. They brought pies and pitchers of lemonade, their curiosity about the newcomer barely veiled by their hospitality. Lydia, dressed in her best blue frock, felt like an exotic bird on display. She answered their questions politely, speaking of her home in Massachusetts, the long train ride, the final, bone-jarring stagecoach journey. Caleb stood by her side, a dutiful and handsome partner. He was attentive, fetching her a plate of food, introducing her to the town preacher and the blacksmith. But Lydia could feel the distance in him. He was physically present, but his mind was elsewhere. His smiles were fleeting, his laughter hollow. It was while he was speaking with a group of ranchers that Lydia found herself momentarily alone near a cluster of townswomen. They spoke in low, conspiratorial tones, believing themselves to be unheard. "A terrible thing. That fire raged for 2 whole days," one woman, a portly figure named Martha, was saying. "And Caleb riding right into the middle of it," added another, her voice filled with awe. "To pull out that widow. Lord have mercy. They say the flames were licking at his horse's hooves." "It was a brave thing to do," Martha conceded, taking a sip of lemonade. "But if you ask me, he spends too much time worrying about that woman. She's been nothing but trouble since her husband was shot. Lives out there all alone, wild as a hawk. It's not right. They say she's rebuilding the cabin herself, pounding nails like a man. Stubborn is what it is. He saved her life, and now he likely feels responsible. But he has a bride now. A proper, decent woman. He needs to put his mind to his own future." The women fell silent as they noticed Lydia standing near, a faint blush on their cheeks. Lydia pretended not to have heard, her heart beating a little faster. May, the reclusive widow. A name to go with the direction of Caleb's haunted gaze. The knot of unease inside her tightened. This was the secret he was hiding. Not a flaw or a dark past, but a person. For the next 2 days, Lydia was a model of patience and propriety. She helped Mrs. Gable in the kitchen. She took walks along the town's single dusty street, and she waited for Caleb to speak. He did not. He called on her each evening, and they would sit on the boarding house porch, talking of weather and crop prices, the chasm of unspoken things widening between them with every polite, meaningless word. Lydia was not a woman to be defeated by silence. Her life had been a lesson in endurance. She had survived the deafening roar of the textile mill, the 14-hour days that left her body aching and her mind numb. She had survived the choking air, thick with cotton lint that stole the breath from your lungs. And she had survived the attentions of men like the floor foreman, men who saw her youth and poverty as an invitation, whose greasy hands and whispered suggestions had taught her how to make herself small and sharp, to build a wall of quiet dignity they could not breach. She had not traveled across a continent to be thwarted by a secret a man was too afraid to name. On the third morning, she made a decision. She rose before dawn and went to the boarding house kitchen, using a portion of Mrs. Gable's flour and some dried apples. She baked a small, fragrant tart. It was a simple, honest thing, a gesture of peace. She wrapped it carefully in a clean cloth. After asking Mrs. Gable for vague directions to the Black Creek claim, receiving a look of sharp disapproval in return, she set out on foot. The sun was already gathering its strength as she left the town behind. The walk was longer and harder than she had anticipated. The road dissolved into a rough track, and the red dust coated her hem and settled in her throat. The landscape was alien and intimidating. The fire had left its mark everywhere, a great black scar across the hills. Charred, skeletal trees clawed at the sky. It was a land of violence and survival, and she began to understand how it could shape a person. She found the claim at the end of the track. The first thing she saw was the stone chimney, standing alone and defiant amidst a square of blackened earth and debris. It was a tombstone for a home. A little ways off, a new structure was taking shape. It was a small, rough-looking cabin, barely one room. The newly cut pine logs a pale gold against the blackened landscape, and in front of it, a woman was working. May was splitting wood. She swung the heavy maul with a steady, powerful rhythm, her body moving with a grim efficiency. She wore a man's trousers and a simple cotton shirt, its sleeves rolled up to reveal muscular, sun-browned arms. Her hair was tied back, but strands had escaped and clung to her sweat-streaked face. When she saw Lydia approaching, she stopped, resting the maul on the ground, and watched her with an unblinking, hostile stare. Her green eyes were as wild and wary as a cornered animal's. Lydia's steps faltered. This was the woman from the whispers. Not just a widow, but a force of nature, forged in grief and solitude. "Can I help you?" May's voice was low and rough, as if from disuse. Lydia stopped a few feet away, holding out her offering. "I'm Lydia. I brought you this, a tart. I hope you like apples." May's eyes flickered from the tart to Lydia's face, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, she said nothing. "Why?" The question was blunt, stripped of all pleasantry. "I'm new here," Lydia said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I wanted to meet my neighbors." A humorless smile touched May's lips. "I'm not the kind of neighbor the good folks in town recommend you meet." She didn't move to take the tart. She just stood there, leaning on the maul, a guardian of her own desolate kingdom. The silence was a challenge. Lydia could have turned around, her duty as a polite newcomer done, but she thought of Caleb's haunted eyes, of the whispers, of her own long journey. She would not be turned away so easily. "They told me what happened," Lydia said softly, gesturing towards the ruins. "About the fire. I'm so very sorry for your loss." Something in May's stony expression softened. "Just a fraction. A house is just wood and nails." "It's more than that," Lydia countered quietly. "It's a life." May finally looked at her then, truly looked at her, and a flicker of grudging respect entered her eyes. She straightened up and took the tart from Lydia's outstretched hands. "Thank you." She unwrapped a corner of the cloth and looked at the neatly crimped pastry. "You have a gentle hand." "I had to learn to be quick and careful," Lydia explained. "In the mill, if your hands were slow, you lost a finger. If they were rough, you ruined the thread." May's curiosity was piqued. The mill? And so, standing in the shadow of a half-built cabin, under the vast and unforgiving sky. Lydia began to speak. She spoke of a world May could barely imagine. A world of brick and smoke, of endless noise, of hundreds of girls packed together in a room so hot and loud you couldn't hear yourself think. She spoke of the exhaustion that was so deep it became a part of you, of the meager wages that barely kept body and soul together. She didn't speak of it with self-pity, but with the flat, factual tone of a survivor cataloging her scars. Then, her voice dropping lower, she spoke of the foreman. She didn't use ugly words. She didn't have to. She spoke of the way he would stand too close, his breath smelling of onions, of the accidental brushes of his hand, of the promotions offered in return for friendliness. She spoke of the fear, the constant, sickening dread of being a young woman with no money, no family, and no power, entirely at the mercy of men who had all three. Some girls, they gave in, Lydia said, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains. They saw it as another kind of work, another price to pay for survival. I couldn't, so I learned to be invisible. I learned to make my face a blank wall, to never show fear, or hope, or anything they could use against me. I saved every penny, and I answered an advertisement in a newspaper. She finally looked at May. I built my own house out of letters and hope. I suppose. May was silent, her expression transformed. The hostility was gone, replaced by a profound, sorrowful understanding. She saw past the delicate dress and the pale skin to the core of tempered steel beneath. She saw another woman who had fought, in her own way, to survive in a world that was determined to crush her. The chasm of their different lives, the reclusive widow and the mail-order bride, had been bridged by the common language of female suffering. He is a good man, Caleb, May said, her voice softer now. It was both a statement and a question. He is honorable, Lydia agreed. He has been kind, but his heart is a locked room, and I do not have the key. She took a deep breath, gathering her courage to say the thing that had brought her here. The women in town, they whisper. They say he saved you from the fire. May's jaw tightened. She looked away, towards the ruins. He did. They think I should be angry, jealous. Lydia paused, her blue eyes searching May's face. But that's not what I feel. I feel like a piece of a story that I don't understand. She took another step closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. May, I have the letters his mother wrote for him. They are full of fine words. But I have seen his eyes. When he looks at you, or even when someone just says your name, his eyes tell a different story, a truer one. I haven't seen him look at anyone or anything else the way he looks at you. The words hung in the still, hot air between them. It was not an accusation. It was a concession, a painful, honest acknowledgement from one woman to another. It was an act of profound and heartbreaking empathy. May stared at her, speechless. She had expected hatred, resentment, the righteous anger of a woman whose place was being threatened. She had not expected this clear-eyed, devastating understanding. She had not expected to be seen before she could find the words to respond. The sound of an approaching horse made them both turn. It was Caleb. He rode up the track, his face a thundercloud of anxiety and anger. He pulled his horse to a halt, his gaze sweeping over the scene. Lydia, standing there with her empty cloth, and May, frozen with a look of stunned vulnerability on her face. He swung down from his saddle, his movement stiff and angry. Lydia, what are you doing out here? I've been looking all over for you. You shouldn't have come. His words were for Lydia, but his eyes were locked on May. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the smoke-hazed sky in shades of bruised purple and fiery orange. It cast long, distorted shadows that stretched from the three figures, binding them together. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with all the things that had been left unsaid. Caleb, caught between the woman he desired and the woman he had promised. Lydia, the gentle but unyielding catalyst, who had refused to remain ignorant, and May, her fortress of solitude breached from two sides at once. They stood there in the dying light, a silent, impossible triangle under the vast, indifferent sky of the west. And in that heavy silence, the real story finally, truly, began. The ride back to town was a long, suffocating silence. Lydia rode her borrowed mule a few paces behind Caleb's stallion, the space between them a chasm filled with unspoken truths. Caleb's back was a rigid wall of muscle, his shoulders set in a line of profound tension. He did not look back at her, not once. The setting sun, which had witnessed their impossible tableau, had now bled away, leaving a bruised twilight sky in its wake. He saw her to the door of the boarding house, his movements stiff and formal. The cheerful yellow light spilling from the windows seemed a mockery of the darkness that had settled between them. "Lydia," he began, his voice rough, scraping from his throat. "About what you saw." "We should speak," she said, her own voice quiet but firm, cutting through his fumbled explanation. "On the porch, where the air is clear." He nodded, his relief at her directness palpable. They sat in the wicker chairs that misses. Gable kept on the porch, the sounds of the town settling for the night. A distant piano from the saloon, the bark of a dog, drifting around them. For a long time, Caleb just stared at his hands, turning his hat over and over. Finally, he spoke, his gaze fixed on the dusty floorboards. "When I found her, in the fire, something happened. I'd never seen anything like it. She was fighting it, fighting the whole world, all alone. I just wanted to get her to safety. That's all it was at first." He looked up, and, in the dim lantern light, Lydia could see the raw agony in his eyes. "We spent the night in a cave. It was cold. I held her to keep her from freezing. We talked. She told me about her husband, about this piece of land. And I felt, I don't know how to explain it. It was like I'd been walking my whole life with my eyes half closed, and suddenly they were wide open. I saw a strength in her, a sorrow so deep it felt like a part of the mountains themselves." He swallowed hard, the confession coming in a torrent now that the dam had broken. "I love her, Lydia. I think I loved her from the moment I saw her standing in front of that burning cabin, refusing to be broken. It's not right. It's not fair to you. God knows. It's the last thing I ever wanted. I made a promise. You traveled all this way on the strength of that promise. I can't abandon you. I won't. My word is my bond." He finally looked at her, his face a mask of misery. "I am a man torn in two." Lydia listened, her hands folded calmly in her lap. She felt a cold, hollow ache spread through her chest. It was the pain of a hope dying, the quiet death of the future she had allowed herself to dream of during the long miles of her journey. She had imagined a simple life with this honorable, strong man, a life of shared work, of quiet companionship, perhaps even of love grown from respect. Now, that vision dissolved like a mirage. She was stunned, but the mill had taught her to hide her tremors. Crying was a luxury, a weakness she had learned long ago she could not afford. Her face remained a placid, unreadable mask. When he finished, the silence was heavy with his shame and her shattered dreams. He expected tears, accusations, a storm of righteous fury. He did not expect the quiet clarity of her response. "Then you need to be honest," she said, her voice even and without a trace of condemnation. "With me and with her." Caleb stared at her, dumbfounded. "What?" This life you offer me," she continued, a sad wisdom in her pale eyes. "A house with a man whose heart is up in those hills with another woman. That is not honor. Caleb, that is a prison for all three of us. It is a lie we would have to tell every day for the rest of our lives. I did not travel 2,000 miles to live a lie." She stood up, the movement full of a quiet grace that shamed his own turmoil. "Be honest. It is the only thing you owe either of us now." With that, She turned and walked into the boarding house, leaving him alone on the porch with the impossible weight of her words. The next day, driven by the sharp prod of Lydia's command, Caleb rode out to May's claim. He found her high on the skeleton of her new roof, hammering shingles with a focused fury. She looked down when he approached. Her face shuddered, her eyes cold. "You shouldn't be here, Caleb," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. "We need to talk. May," he called up to her.
"We have nothing to talk about."
She turned her back on him, hammering another nail with 3 sharp, vicious strokes. He wouldn't be deterred. "I spoke to Lydia. I told her—" This made her stop. She slowly turned back, her face pale beneath the grime and sweat.
"You did what? You fool! You foolish, selfish man!"
She scrambled down the crude ladder, landing lightly on her feet. She marched up to him, her green eyes blazing. "What did you hope to achieve? You think you can break that girl's heart and I'll just— what? Welcome you with open arms? Is that your idea of honor?" "It's not about honor. It's about the truth," he shot back, his frustration boiling over. "I love you, May." The words, spoken aloud in the clear light of day, seemed to hang in the air and then shatter. May flinched as if struck. "Don't you say that to me," she hissed, her voice low and trembling. "Don't you dare. She crossed a continent for you. She left everything she knew behind based on your promise. You belong to her, and I will not be the woman who destroys another woman's hope. I will not be a homewrecker. I've been called many things in this valley, but I won't be that." "May, please," he began, reaching for her. She slapped his hand away. "Go," she commanded, her voice like stone. "Go back to your bride and build a life with her. Forget you ever met me. That's the only decent thing left for you to do. Now get off my land." She turned her back on him, presenting a wall as unyielding as the mountains behind her. Defeated, his heart a leaden weight in his chest, Caleb mounted his horse and rode away. He had been honest, as Lydia had asked, and it had solved nothing. 2 days later, it was Lydia who made the journey. The sky was a strange, bruised yellow, and the air was heavy and thick, promising a storm. She found May clearing rocks from what would be her garden, her movements relentless, punishing. May straightened as Lydia approached, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of a dirty glove. Her eyes were wary. "If you've come to curse me, you may as well get it over with."
"I haven't come to curse you,"
Lydia said, stopping a few feet away.
"I've come to talk sense to you."
May gave a short, bitter laugh.
"There's no sense to be had in any of this."
"He told me he loves you," Lydia stated, her gaze direct. "And then he told me you sent him away. I did what was right." "Was it?" Lydia took a step closer. "Was it right to send him back to me, knowing his heart would never be there? Was it right to sentence me to a life with a ghost? Was it right to sentence him to a life of regret?" She paused, her voice softening. "And was it right to deny yourself, May? After everything you've lost, to turn your back on the first hint of life because you're afraid?" May's face hardened. "You know nothing about my fear." "I know what it looks like," Lydia countered, her voice ringing with the authority of her own hard-won survival. "I've lived with it my whole life. There's the fear that makes you run, and there's the fear that makes you build a wall around yourself so high that nothing can get out, but nothing can get in, either. You've built a mighty wall, May." Lydia looked from the half-finished cabin to the ruins of the old one, and then back to the defiant woman in front of her. She took a deep breath.
"So this is how it is,"
she said, her voice clear and resolute in the unnaturally still air. "I will not marry a man who loves another, and I will not stand by and watch 3 people destroy themselves out of fear and misguided duty. So you have a choice to make." She locked eyes with May, her own pale blue ones unflinching. "If you still love him, then you must stop hiding from it. You must fight for it. And if you're too afraid, if you truly mean to send him away for good, then I will be the one to leave. I will take the next stagecoach east, and none of this will be your problem anymore." May stared at her, utterly stunned. This was not a plea. It was an ultimatum, delivered with the quiet force of a tectonic plate shifting. Lydia was handing her the power to decide all of their fates, forcing her to confront the very heart of her own terror. The first drop of rain, fat and heavy, splattered in the dust between them. Then another and another. The wind began to moan, whipping dust and ash into the air. The sky, which had been yellow, was now a dark, churning purple. "A storm's coming," May said, her voice a hoarse whisper. "A bad one. You need to get back to town." "No," Lydia said, not moving. "I'm not leaving until you have an answer." Just then, Caleb appeared, riding hard up the track. He had seen the sky and had the same thought. He pulled his horse to a halt, his face grim. "You're both fools for being out in this. The creek's going to flash. We need to get to high ground. Now!" But it was already too late. The sky opened up, and the rain came down not in drops, but in solid, wind-driven sheets. Thunder cracked directly overhead, a deafening explosion that made the ground tremble. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of gray water and roaring wind. "The cabin!" Caleb yelled, grabbing Lydia's arm and pulling May's. "It's our only chance!" They half ran, half stumbled through the blinding rain to the small, unfinished structure. They fell inside, Caleb forcing the rough plank doors shut against the fury of the storm. For a moment, they just stood there, gasping and soaked to the bone. The roar of the wind and rain outside a deafening onslaught. The small cabin, with its unchinked logs and gaping hole where a window would be, felt terrifyingly fragile. Water dripped from the roof and blew in through the cracks. Hours passed. The storm did not abate. The sound of the creek, normally a gentle murmur, had risen to a furious, grinding roar. They were trapped, the three of them, in one small, dark room. The air thick with the smell of wet wool, damp earth, and suffocating tension. Lydia, shivering, retreated to a corner and sat on an upturned crate, pulling a damp blanket around her shoulders. She became a silent observer, her face calm and patient, as if she were simply waiting for the inevitable conclusion of a play she had set in motion. Caleb and May stood near the center of the room, separated by a few feet of charged space. Finally, Caleb could bear the silence no longer. "Damn you, May!" he said, his voice low and ragged with emotion. "Do you see what your pride has done? It's trapped us, all of us." "My pride?" she shot back, her voice shaking. "This is your doing. You made a promise to her." "And I'll keep it if I have to," he yelled, taking a step toward her. "I will marry her, and I will be a good husband, and I will die a little bit every single day looking at her and seeing you. Is that what you want? Is that what your damned righteousness demands?" "It's better than the alternative," she cried, her composure finally starting to crumble. "Better than shame, better than being a pariah, better than destroying a good woman's life." "Look at her, May!" Caleb gestured to the corner where Lydia sat, a quiet, motionless shadow. "Just look at her. Do you think she wants that? Do you think that proud, honest woman wants a life built on a lie? She is stronger than you and me both. She is offering us a truth, and you are too terrified to take it." He was in front of her now, his hands gripping her shoulders. The rain hammered on the roof, and a flash of lightning illuminated the tears streaming down her face, mingling with the rain. "What are you so afraid of?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a desperate, broken whisper. "Losing me? You're already losing me. Are you afraid of loving someone again? Are you afraid of letting Elias go?" The mention of her husband's name was the final blow. A terrible, ragged sob tore from May's throat. It was the sound of 2 years of unshed grief, of loneliness, of a heart walled up in stone, finally breaking. "Yes," she wept, her body shaking with the force of her confession. She beat a fist against his chest. "Yes, I'm afraid. I buried him. I buried love.
I promised myself. I promised.
She looked up at him. Her green eyes flooded with a pain so raw it was unbearable to witness.
But I couldn't. From the moment you pulled me onto that horse, I have tried so hard to hate you for it, but I can't.
Her voice broke.
I haven't been able to forget you.
In the corner, Lydia quietly rose and moved to the far wall, turning her back, giving them the small gift of her absence. Caleb's face softened, all the anger draining away, replaced by an overwhelming tenderness. He framed her face in his hands, his thumbs wiping away her tears. "You don't have to forget him, May," he whispered. "You just have to let me in." He lowered his head, and in the heart of the storm, as thunder rattled the very logs of the cabin, he kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of desperation and relief, of anger and solace, of 2 years of loneliness crashing against a sudden, undeniable wave of life. For May, it was a cataclysm. It was the shattering of a vow, the breaking of a fortress. It was the first time she had allowed her heart, her body, her very soul to feel anything but the cold weight of loss. It was surrender, and as she kissed him back, a flood of feeling so powerful it stole her breath. She felt the walls inside her finally, irrevocably, come crashing down. The dawn that followed the storm was unnervingly quiet. The world outside the small cabin was washed clean, the blackened earth soaked and steaming in the pale, tentative light. The furious roar of the creek had subsided into a powerful, steady rush, a reminder of the night's violence. Inside, the air was cool and damp. May awoke first. She was lying on a bed of pine boughs, a rough blanket pulled over her. For a disorienting moment, she didn't know where she was. Then the memory of the storm, of Caleb's desperate words, of his kiss, came rushing back. It was a memory so vivid, so overwhelming, that it felt like a brand on her soul. She sat up, her heart pounding. Caleb was asleep near the door, his body a dark, solid shape against the gray light. He had given her the only blanket, and in the corner, on the upturned crate where she had sat as a silent witness, Lydia was gone. A cold dread, sharp and immediate, seized May. She looked around the small space. Lydia's reticule was gone. Her shawl was gone. Propped against the crate was a small, flat piece of kindling. Scratched into its surface with a piece of charcoal were a few stark words. May crept closer, her bare feet silent on the damp earthen floor. The message was not for her, nor for Caleb. It was a declaration, a final, definitive statement. She deserves to watch. I deserve to choose. May's breath caught in her throat. She deserves to watch love unfold, to witness happiness, to be given the chance that had been stolen from her. It was an act of profound, selfless release. I deserve to choose. The words of a queen, not a victim. The quiet, unassailable assertion of a woman claiming her own life, her own destiny. Just then, Caleb stirred and sat up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. He saw May, saw the piece of wood in her hand, and then his gaze shot to the empty corner. A look of pure panic crossed his face.
"No,"
he breathed, scrambling to his feet. He strode over and took the kindling from her hand, his eyes scanning the words. A muscle worked in his jaw. He looked out the open doorway into the desolate, washed-out landscape. "No, you don't get to do this. Lydia," he whispered to the empty wilderness. "You don't get to be the martyr." Without another word, he pulled on his boots, grabbed his hat, and strode out of the cabin. A moment later, May heard the sound of his horse's hooves, fast and frantic, disappearing down the muddy track. She was left alone in the quiet cabin, the echo of Lydia's choice and Caleb's desperation ringing in the silence. Caleb rode like a man possessed. He followed the main track back toward town, his eyes scanning the churned-up mud for any sign of footprints leading off the path. The creek was still a torrent, brown and angry, and he knew the lower trails would be impassable. She must have stayed on high ground. He cursed himself. He had been so lost in May, in the cataclysm of her surrender, that he had forgotten the quiet, steady woman in the corner. He had forgotten that her heart was the true price of his happiness. Lydia's brand of strength was not loud or defiant like May's. It was a deep, unyielding river, and now that river had changed its course, and he was terrified of where it might lead. He imagined her walking back to town, head held high, to book passage on the next stagecoach east, back to the mills, back to the life of quiet desperation she had so bravely fled. The thought was a knife in his gut. He had brought her here with a promise, and he had broken it in the most fundamental way. He could not, would not, allow her to be the sole casualty of his heart's treason. He was a mile from the cabin when he saw it. A small, scuffed mark in the mud leading off the main track and into the skeletal, fire-ravaged forest. He dismounted, his heart pounding. The tracks were small, neat. Hers. She wasn't going back to town. She was striking out on her own. Into this, he looked at the harsh, unforgiving landscape. A place that could kill a seasoned frontiersman, let alone a woman from the city. The panic turned to a cold, sharp fear. He followed the trail on foot, leading his horse. It was slow going. The ground was slick with mud and littered with fallen, half-burnt branches. He called her name, the sound swallowed by the immense, dripping silence of the forest. He found her in a small clearing, a place where a cluster of great pines had somehow survived the fire. She had gathered a pile of damp branches and was trying, with a grim and clumsy determination, to lash them together into a crude A-frame shelter. Her hands were scratched, her dress was stained with mud and charcoal, and her face was pale with exhaustion. But her jaw was set in a line of stubborn resolve. She was not crying, she was working. She didn't look up until he was standing just a few feet away. When she saw him, her face registered not surprise, but a weary resignation. "You should have let me go, Caleb," she said, her voice flat. "Let you go where?" he demanded, his voice rough with fear and anger. "To die out here. What in God's name do you think you're doing?" "I am surviving," she answered, her gaze steady. "It is what I have always done. I will not be a ghost in your house. Caleb, a constant reminder of your broken promise. And I will not be a burden on May, a price she must pay for her own heart. I do not wish to be the third person in a room, the superfluous one, the object of pity." "Pity?" he scoffed, taking a step closer. "Lydia, what I feel for you is anything but pity. It's a respect so deep it frightens me." "Respect does not keep a woman warm at night," she said, her voice finally trembling, the first crack in her formidable composure. "I cannot go back, not to the mill, not to that life. My hope for a new one died in that cabin last night. But my will to live did not, so I will do what I must. I will build a shelter. I will learn to hunt. I will survive." He looked at her, at this small, delicate woman, proposing to tame this brutal wilderness with nothing but the sheer force of her will, and he felt a wave of awe so powerful it buckled his knees. He had been so focused on May's fiery, defiant strength that he had failed to truly see Lydia's quiet, indomitable fortitude. They were two sides of the same coin, two different forms of a power he had never encountered before. And he knew, with a certainty that shook him to his core, that he could not live without either one. Words had failed him. Words were what had gotten them into this mess, words in letters, promises spoken, confessions torn from their souls. Words were no longer enough. Slowly, deliberately, Caleb went down on one knee in the mud before her. It was not a proposal of marriage, but an act of supplication, of utter, humbled surrender. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and gently, reverently. He placed his palm flat against her stomach, over the simple gray fabric of her dress. Lydia flinched, her eyes wide with shock. He looked up at her, his own eyes clear and filled with a desperate,
Radical plea. The life we knew, the rules we knew, they don't fit here.
Lydia, he said, his voice low and thick with emotion. This land, it breaks things down to what's real. And this is real. He pressed his hand a little firmer, a gesture of connection, of grounding. If you ever have a child, if we ever have a child, it will need more than just one person to raise it right. It will need a father who is honest. It will need a mother who is brave. He paused, his gaze boring into hers. And it will need to be taught what a strong woman is. And for that, it will need both of you. It will need May's fire, and it will need your strength. Don't take that away from a future that hasn't even been born yet. Please, Lydia, come back, not as a ghost, not as a burden, but as a founder. Come back and help us build something new. Tears, hot and silent, finally began to stream down Lydia's pale cheeks. They were not tears of sorrow, but of shock, of confusion, and of a strange, terrifying new kind of hope. The future he was painting was one that had no name, no map. It was a wilderness as uncharted as the one surrounding them. But he was not asking her to be a third part of a broken whole. He was asking her to be an essential part of a new creation. She did not give him an answer in words. She simply let out a long, shuddering breath and allowed him to take her hand and help her to her feet. When they returned to the cabin, they found May outside, her few meager possessions wrapped in a blanket. Daisy saddled and waiting. She had come to the same conclusion as Lydia, that the only solution was to remove herself from the equation. When she saw them walking up the track together, Caleb leading his horse, Lydia at his side, she froze. Lydia walked ahead of Caleb, straight towards May. The two women stopped in front of each other. The air crackled with a tension that was different now, not of rivalry, but of a shared, profound ordeal. They simply looked at each other for a long time, two survivors of a shipwreck, taking each other's measure on the shore of a strange new world. In May's eyes, Lydia saw guilt and a fierce, sorrowful pride. In Lydia's eyes, May saw not accusation, but an unnerving, clear-sighted empathy, and a strength that humbled her. It was Lydia who broke the silence, who made the first move. She reached out and placed a hand gently on May's shoulder. May flinched but did not pull away. "You don't have to go," Lydia said, her voice soft but firm. "And I don't have to go either." She looked at May, her gaze unwavering. "I know the rules of the world. I know what the preacher would say. But Caleb is right. Those rules don't seem to fit here." A small, sad smile touched her lips. "If you cannot call him your husband, then please, May, call me your sister." May stared at her, her tough facade crumbling. A sister. In all her lonely, bitter years, it was a word she had never dared to hope for. A single tear escaped and traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. She gave a short, jerky nod. Unable to speak, the pact was sealed, not with a handshake or an embrace, but with a shared look of terrifying, uncertain, and deeply hopeful understanding. And so, the three of them began. Life in the one-room cabin was an exercise in awkward, painful grace. It was a constant, clumsy negotiation of space and feeling. They worked together to finish the cabin, their movements hesitant at first, then falling into a strange, unspoken rhythm. Caleb, a man of boundless physical energy, did the heavy lifting, felling trees and hewing logs. May, with her practical knowledge of the land, showed them how to chink the logs with mud and moss to keep out the wind. And Lydia, with her meticulous nature and nimble fingers, took charge of the interior, weaving rush mats for the floor and organizing their few supplies with a quiet efficiency that brought a semblance of order to their chaotic world. They ate their meals in near silence, the air thick with things they did not know how to say. The nights were the hardest. They created a makeshift curtain to divide the small space, giving the women a semblance of privacy. Caleb slept on the floor by the door, a self-appointed guardian, though what he was guarding them from, or for, None of them could have said. They were a fragile, impossible trinity, held together by a shared crisis and a radical, unspoken agreement. It was a life filled with longing and restraint, and a hope so new and fragile they were afraid to speak its name for fear it might shatter. But the outside world could not be kept at bay forever. When their supplies ran low, Caleb and Lydia rode into town. May refused to go, unwilling to face the stares. The moment Caleb and Lydia walked into the general store, a hush fell over the room. Conversation stopped, heads turned. The whispers started almost immediately, a virulent, rustling sound that followed them down the aisles. Mr. Henderson, the storekeeper, served them with a tight, disapproving frown, counting out their change as if the coins were tainted. Outside, the whispers became bolder. Martha, the woman from the church social, stood with a group of women, her arms crossed, her face a mask of righteous indignation. "Shameless," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the street. "Keeping 2 women in that cabin, it's an abomination, an offense against God." Lydia's face remained impassive, the blank wall she had perfected in the mill. But Caleb's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He guided Lydia back to the horses, his jaw tight. The next week, it got worse. One evening, as they sat outside watching the sunset, a rock came flying out of the twilight and crashed against the cabin wall. It was followed by another. A group of men, drunk on saloon whiskey and self-righteousness, stood at the edge of the clearing, their shapes dark against the fading light. "Come on out, Caleb," one of them yelled, his voice slurred. "Which one you warming your bed with tonight, or is it both?" A raw fury, hotter than any fire, surged through Caleb. Before May or Lydia could stop him, he was on his feet and striding towards them. "Get off this land," he growled, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Now." "Or what?" sneered the man, a burly ranch hand named Jeb. "You gonna have your women fight for you?" That was all it took. Caleb launched himself at the man, his fist connecting with a sickening crack. The clearing erupted into a brawl. It was 3 against 1. Caleb was strong, a seasoned fighter, but the odds were against him. He fought with a desperate, savage energy, a wild animal defending his territory, his strange, impossible family. The women watched in horror from the doorway. May started to run forward with a piece of firewood, but Lydia grabbed her arm. "No, they'll turn on us." Caleb went down under a rain of blows. He managed to fight his way back to his feet, blood streaming from his nose and a cut over his eye. He landed one more solid punch that sent Jeb staggering back, before another man kicked his legs out from under him, finally, having vented their drunken rage. The men laughed, spat on the ground, and melted back into the woods. Caleb lay on the ground, groaning. May and Lydia rushed to his side. They helped him stumble back into the cabin, his arm draped over both their shoulders. He was a mess of bruises and cuts, his lips split open, one eye already swelling shut. They worked together in the flickering lamplight, a silent, efficient team. May, with her knowledge of herbs, cleaned his wounds with a poultice of yarrow to stop the bleeding. Lydia, with her steady hands, stitched the cut over his eye with a fine needle and thread. Caleb bore it all in silence, his eyes closed, his breathing harsh. When they were done, they helped him to his bed of pine boughs. He was battered and wounded, but in his defense of them, something had been forged. The rocks, the fists, the hateful words, they had been meant to break them apart. Instead, they had become the fire that had welded the 3 of them together. They were no longer just a man and 2 women. They were a fortress, and the siege had just begun. The fight marked a turning point. The fragile peace of their isolation was shattered, and the hostility of the outside world was no longer a distant murmur, but a physical, bruising reality. In the days that followed, a tense, watchful quiet settled over the cabin. They moved around each other with a new, somber tenderness. their shared purpose forged in the crucible of that ugly brawl. May's hands were gentle as she changed the dressing on Caleb's eye. Lydia's voice was soft as she read aloud from her only book, a worn copy of Shakespeare, to fill the long, quiet evenings. And Caleb, as he healed, watched them both with a look of fierce, wounded protectiveness. They were no longer three individuals sharing a roof. They were a single, besieged entity. The pressure from the town, however, was a slow, tightening vice. When May and Lydia ventured to the creek for water, they sometimes found crude, ugly words scratched into the mud of the bank. Supplies left for them at the edge of their claim were often spoiled or tampered with. They were being starved out, ostracized with a deliberate, cold-blooded cruelty. The world was shrinking, the walls of their small valley closing in, and the air grew thick with the inevitability of a final confrontation. It came on a Sunday, a week after the fight. The sun was high and unforgiving. Beating down on the newly finished roof of the cabin, a lone rider approached, not with the drunken aggression of their previous visitors, but with a slow, deliberate gravity. It was Reverend Miller, the town preacher, his black coat an incongruous slash of judgment against the wild, untamed landscape. He rode a placid, well-fed mare, and his face, usually arranged in an expression of benign piety, was set in grim, determined lines. Caleb met him in the clearing, positioning himself squarely between the preacher and the cabin door, where May and Lydia stood watching, silent and apprehensive. "Caleb," the Reverend began, not dismounting, his position on horseback giving him an air of elevated authority. "I have not come here as an enemy. I have come as a shepherd who has found a lamb straying dangerously far from the flock." "I'm not straying, Reverend," Caleb said, his voice even. "I'm home." The preacher's gaze flickered past him to the two women in the doorway. He sighed, a sound of theatrical sorrow. "Son, the town is in an uproar. You have flouted the laws of God and man. You have taken in a mail-order bride, a woman to whom you are promised in the eyes of the Lord, and yet you live in this arrangement with another. It is a scandal. It is an open sore on the moral fabric of our community. What we do on this land is our own business," Caleb stated, his stance unyielding. "There is no land so remote that the eyes of God cannot see it," the preacher thundered, his voice gaining the familiar cadence of the pulpit. "He sees this sin, this mockery of the holy sacrament of marriage. I have prayed on this, Caleb. I have consulted the elders, and we have come to a decision, for the good of your own soul, and for the peace of this community. You must put an end to this. You must choose." The word hung in the air, cold and sharp as a blade. "Choose." "You will send the widow away, or you will send Miss Lydia back to her people," the Reverend commanded. "You will take one, and only one, to be your lawfully wedded wife. You will stand before me in the church and sanctify your union. There is no other path. This is the law. You have until next Sunday to make your decision. After that, the community will be forced to take its own measures to cleanse this stain from our midst." He did not elaborate on what those measures might be. He didn't have to. The threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating as smoke. Without another word, he turned his mare and rode away, a black-coated arbiter of a world that had no place for them. The preacher's ultimatum shattered the fragile peace within the cabin. It gave voice to all their deepest fears, dragging their unspoken anxieties into the harsh light of day. For May, it was a confirmation of everything she believed about herself. She was the problem. She was the scandal, the widow, the wild woman who had brought sin and trouble to Caleb's door. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on her, stealing the air from her lungs. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay on her cot, listening to the quiet breathing of the other two, and felt like a disease, a poison that was slowly killing everything it touched. Lydia's quiet strength, Caleb's fierce loyalty, she was destroying it all. She had survived the loss of her husband, the fire, the loneliness, but she could not survive being the cause of their ruin. Before the first hint of dawn, she rose, moving with the silence of a ghost. She gathered her few things, a spare shirt, the tintype of Elias, a small sack of dried jerky. She scribbled a hasty, tear-blotted note, leaving it on the rough-hewn table. He was right. I am the stain. Forgive me. She saddled Daisy in the pre-dawn gloom, her movements clumsy, her hands shaking. She would go west, into the mountains, disappear. It was the only way. It was her final, necessary sacrifice. She was just about to swing into the saddle when the cabin door creaked open. Lydia stood there, a silhouette against the dark interior, a blanket clutched around her shoulders.
And where do you think you're going?
Lydia's voice was not soft. It was as cold and hard as river stone.
Away,
May choked out, not looking at her.
It's for the best. He has to choose you. It's the only way.
So you run, Lydia said, stepping out into the clearing. You run, and you leave us to pick up the pieces of the life you've shattered. Is that your idea of courage?
It's not courage, it's necessity,
May whispered, her hand trembling on the saddle horn.
I am what's wrong with this. I'm the one who doesn't belong.
You fool, Lydia said, her voice low and laced with a fury May had never heard before. May finally turned to face her.
You can't understand.
Can't I? Lydia walked towards her until they were only an arm's length apart. The first rays of sun were just beginning to touch the highest peaks, casting the valley in a deep blue shadow. I understand that I am being offered a life with half a man. I understand that I am being asked to live a lie, to be a constant, walking monument to your cowardice. You think your leaving is a gift to me? It's a curse.
He will learn to love you,
May insisted, her voice pleading.
And you will what? Die alone in the mountains? Convinced of your own noble sacrifice?
Lydia's eyes flashed in the dim light.
You think that your suffering makes you righteous.
It doesn't, it just makes you a coward. The word struck May with the force of a physical blow. She recoiled, shaking her head. No.
Yes.
Lydia took another step, her face inches from May's. You are so terrified of being happy, so convinced that you don't deserve it, that you would rather destroy 3 lives than fight for one. And then, Lydia did something that shattered the morning quiet. She drew back her hand and slapped May, hard, across the face. The sound was sharp and ugly in the stillness. May's head snapped to the side, a stunned gasp escaping her lips. Her cheek stung, the shock of it a sudden, blazing fire that burned through the fog of her self-pity. She stared at Lydia, her eyes wide with disbelief. Lydia did not look angry anymore. Her face was a mask of desperate, painful intensity, tears welling in her own eyes.
Do not do this,
Lydia whispered, her voice shaking with the force of her emotion.
Do not run away and leave us with this half-life, because if you leave now,
if you run from this, then you make it a sin. You make our love for you a shameful, ugly thing that had to be hidden and destroyed. But if you stay, if you fight, then you make it what it is. A truth. A difficult, impossible truth. But a truth nonetheless. Don't you dare turn our truth into a sin. May stood, frozen, her cheek burning, Lydia's words ringing in her ears. You make our love for you a shameful, ugly thing. The thought was more painful than the slap, more searing than any fire. She had been so focused on her own guilt, her own role as the outcast, that she had failed to see the devastating consequence of her flight. She would not be saving them. She would be invalidating them, turning their radical, fragile love into nothing more than a sordid mistake. The cabin door opened again. Caleb stood there, his face pale, the note in his hand. He had seen and heard everything. He looked from May's stunned face to Lydia's tear-streaked one, and a look of slow, dawning resolution settled over his features. He walked past them without a word and began gathering his tools. his axe, his saw, his adze.
"Caleb, what are you doing?"
May asked, her voice a hoarse whisper. He didn't answer. He walked to the north side of the cabin, the side that faced the mountains, and with a powerful swing, he sank his axe into the solid pine logs of the wall. He was not chopping wood. He was chopping a hole in their home. He worked with a silent, manic energy for the rest of the day. May and Lydia watched, stunned into silence at first, and then, slowly beginning to understand, he was not destroying their home. He was expanding it. He was cutting an opening, framing a doorway into a new space, a new room that would be connected to the main cabin. The next morning, he rode into town. He did not go to the general store. He went to the lumber mill and bought a wagon load of freshly cut planks. Then he went to the church. He found Reverend Miller tending his small garden. "I have made my choice, Reverend," Caleb said, his voice calm and clear. The preacher looked up, a satisfied smile on his face. "Excellent, my son. And which?" "I choose them both," Caleb cut him off. "And I am building a house big enough for my family. This Sunday, when you are expecting my decision, I invite you and the entire town to come to my land. Come and see the home I have built. Then you can make your judgment." He left the preacher standing agape, his trowel dangling from his hand. The news spread through the town like wildfire. It was an act of defiance so audacious, so insane, that it bordered on blasphemy. For the next few days, a steady stream of riders passed by the claim, slowing to stare at the madman who was building an addition to his cabin, and at the two women who now worked alongside him, their faces set with a strange, new resolve. By Saturday evening, it was done. A new room, small but sturdy, connected to the main cabin by an open doorway. It had its own window and its own narrow cot. It was not a separate space, but an integral part of the whole. That night, for the first time, there was no curtain. The three of them were in a single, shared space. The air was electric, charged with a new, terrifying intimacy. They sat around the fire, the silence not awkward, but filled with a profound, trembling anticipation. After a long time, Caleb stood and banked the fire, leaving only a single candle burning on the table, its flame casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. He looked at Lydia, who gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Then he turned to May. He held out his hand. "May," he said, his voice soft. She looked at his outstretched hand, then up at his face. Her heart was a wild bird, beating against the cage of her ribs. This was it, the final wall. The fear was a cold, coiling serpent in her belly. But Lydia's words echoed in her mind. "Don't you dare turn our truth into a sin." She took a deep, shuddering breath and placed her trembling hand in his. He led her into the new room, to the cot he had built for her. He sat on the edge, drawing her down beside him. He did not kiss her. He did not touch her beyond her hand in his. He just sat with her, allowing her to feel the reality of the moment. Then, Lydia entered the room. She did not stay in the doorway. She came and sat on the other side of May, and with a gesture of profound and gentle solidarity, she took May's other hand. May sat between them, a conduit for a current she could barely comprehend. She was trembling uncontrollably, the years of solitude and grief and fear all culminating in this single, terrifying, beautiful moment. She was not alone. Caleb watched her, his eyes full of a love so patient and so deep it seemed to anchor her very soul. He slowly raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles. Then he looked across her at Lydia, a look of gratitude, of partnership, passing between them. He turned his gaze back to May. He leaned in, slowly, giving her every chance to turn away. She did not. She watched him come, her green eyes wide and luminous in the candlelight, when his lips finally touched hers. It was with an almost unbearable gentleness. It was not a kiss of passion, but of consecration. It was the final, gentle pressure that broke the dam of her resistance. Not with force, but with acceptance. It was a release. All the fight went out of her, replaced by a wave of feeling so profound it felt like coming home. The last of her resistance washed away, leaving nothing but the raw, aching, open truth of her heart. From her place by May's side, Lydia watched, her hand holding fast. A small, quiet smile touched her lips. There was no jealousy in it, no sorrow, only a deep, peaceful vindication. She deserves to watch, she thought, the words a silent prayer, to watch a heart heal, to watch a soul come back to life. Later, when the candle had burned low, they lay down, not in separate beds, not in separate rooms, but side by side. Caleb in the middle, May on one side, Lydia on the other, in the soft, flickering light, surrounded by the vast, dark wilderness and the judgment of the world. They lay together, hand in hand. For the first time, there were no lies, there were no ghosts. There was only the quiet, radical, and undeniable truth of the three of them, breathing as one in the house they had built together. The Sunday of Caleb's invitation arrived with a tense, expectant stillness. The town did not come. A few riders passed on the main track, their curiosity warring with their disapproval, but none turned toward the cabin. Reverend Miller did not appear. The invitation, an act of audacious defiance, was met with a wall of silent, unified condemnation. The judgment had been passed. They were pariahs, an island of their own making, and the world had turned its back. The weeks that followed were the loneliest of their lives. The shunning was absolute. In town, storekeepers served them with cold, clipped words, sometimes claiming to be out of stock of the very items displayed on the shelves. Old acquaintances turned their heads, their faces hardening into masks of indifference. The children, echoing their parents, would sometimes yell names from a safe distance. The trio became ghosts in their own community, visible only as objects of scorn. But inside the cabin with its new room, a different world was taking shape. The external pressure, meant to tear them apart, instead fused them together. They learned to rely on each other for everything. Caleb worked their small plot of land with a relentless energy, his axe ringing in the mornings, a sound of stubborn life. He was a better farmer than Elias had been. With an instinct for the soil and the seasons, he hunted with a quiet skill, always bringing home enough to sustain them. May, freed from the crushing weight of a grief she no longer had to bear alone, began to rediscover parts of herself she thought were long dead. A dry, witty humor emerged, catching Caleb and Lydia by surprise and making them laugh. Her knowledge of the land was encyclopedic. She knew which roots were edible, which leaves made a soothing tea, which mushrooms would kill a man and which would flavor a stew. She taught Lydia the names of the wildflowers and the calls of the different birds. Lydia, in turn, brought a quiet order and grace to their lives. She had a knack for making a home out of nothing. She patched their clothes with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She found ways to make their monotonous diet of game and cornbread feel like a feast. She was the calm center of their small, turbulent world. Her unshakable composure a balm to May's fiery spirit and Caleb's restless energy. They were a closed circuit, a self-sustaining system of work and companionship, and a love that was still too new, too radical, to be named. The town, for its part, could not ignore them completely. A man's character, like a river, will eventually make its mark on even the hardest stone. Ranchers who needed a horse broken began to swallow their pride and seek out Caleb, because it was an acknowledged fact that no one in the territory had a better hand with a difficult animal. He was honest in his dealings, and his work was impeccable. Women who tore a fine piece of lace or a good dress would quietly send their daughters to the edge of the claim, where Lydia would accept the item and return it a day later, perfectly mended, for a small price. Her work was better and cheaper than the seamstress in town. They were useful, and in the West, utility was a virtue that could, over time, outweigh even the most deeply held moral objections. The town still judged them, but a grudging respect began to creep in at the edges of their condemnation. They were sinners, yes, but they were their sinners, and they were undeniably capable. The first frost of autumn had just silvered the land when the sickness came. It started with the children of a family on an outlying homestead. A fever, a deep, rattling cough, and a weakness that left them pale and listless. It was dismissed as a bad cold, but then the parents fell ill, and the fever burned hotter, and the cough became a desperate, breathless struggle. It began to spread. It moved through the town like a phantom, silent and invisible, leaving devastation in its wake. They called it the lung fever. It respected no one, not the righteous, not the wealthy, not the strong. The town's only doctor, a man old in years and weary in spirit, was overwhelmed within a week. And then he, too, took to his bed, his own breath growing shallow. Panic became a cold, constant companion in the town. Doors were barred. People scurried through the streets, faces covered with handkerchiefs, avoiding each other's eyes. The fear was as palpable as the biting autumn wind. It was a young boy, no older than 10, who brought the plague to their door. He was the son of Jeb, the man who had led the brawl against Caleb. The boy stumbled up to the cabin, delirious with fever, having run from a home where both his parents lay sick. He collapsed in the clearing, his small body racked with shivers. Caleb carried him inside, and they laid him by the fire. May felt his forehead, her face grim. She recognized the signs, the dry heat of the skin, the rasping sound in his chest. Lydia immediately began boiling water, her movements calm and efficient. This was a world she understood. The close, fetid air of sickness was no stranger to someone from the crowded tenements of the East. "We can't," Caleb said, his voice low. "We can't risk it, all of us, in this small space." "We can't turn him away," Lydia said, her voice firm. "To do so would make us less than the people who condemn us." May looked at the boy, and then at Lydia, and a decision was made without another word being spoken. This was not about forgiveness or forgetting. It was about life and death. The rules of the world had once again failed to apply. May went out into the woods, her gathering basket on her arm. She moved with a sureness that was born of generations of knowledge, passed from mother to daughter. She stripped the bark from a willow tree, a tea to fight the fever. She dug up the roots of a mullein plant to make a poultice for the boy's congested chest. She gathered wild cherry bark to soothe his ragged cough. She was no longer May, the widow, or May, the outcast. She was a healer, her hands and her mind filled with the potent, ancient magic of the earth. Back at the cabin, Lydia took charge of their small world. She quarantined the sick boy in the new room, allowing only May to enter. She scrubbed every surface of the main cabin with lye soap and boiling water. She was a general fighting an invisible enemy, her weapons, cleanliness, and order. The boy, against all odds, began to improve. The fever broke, the cough lessened, and when his terrified father, Jeb, finally came looking for him, he found his son sitting up, drinking a broth Lydia had made, weak but clearly on the road to recovery. Jeb stood in the doorway, a man humbled and broken by fear, and looked at the 3 people who he had taunted and beaten. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He just nodded, his eyes filled with a gratitude so profound it was painful, and led his son home. The story spread through the town faster than the fever itself. The outcasts, the sinners on the hill, had saved Jeb's boy. Soon, others came, a frantic mother with a sick baby, a rancher, his face pale with fear, asking for something, anything, to help his wife. They did not turn anyone away. Their cabin, once a symbol of shame, became a house of healing, a beacon in the desperate, frightening time. They divided the labor, falling into the roles that nature and experience had designed for them. May became the town's doctor. She went into the homes of the sick, her basket of herbs her only shield, her face calm and determined. She was tireless, moving from house to house, her presence a quiet promise that they were not alone. The women who had whispered about her now welcomed her with tears of gratitude, trusting her hands, her knowledge, her strange, wild grace. Lydia, seeing the terror in the eyes of the healthy children whose parents were ill, organized a sanctuary. She took them in, turning the church hall, the very place where she had been introduced as Caleb's bride, into a makeshift nursery and school. She was firm but kind, keeping them occupied with stories and lessons, ensuring they were fed and warm. She created an island of childhood innocence in a sea of adult fear, and the mothers and fathers of the town, free to care for their sick without worrying for their well, blessed her name. And Caleb took on the grimmest task of all. Men were dying. The ground was hardening with the coming winter, and there was no one with the strength or the heart to dig the graves. The preacher was busy with last rites. The other men were sick themselves or tending to their families. So Caleb took up his shovel. He went to the small, wind-swept cemetery behind the church, and he dug. He worked alone, from sunup to sundown, the rhythmic scrape and thud of his shovel the only sound. It was hard, lonely, heartbreaking work. When a man died, Caleb would go to the house, wrap the body in a clean sheet, and carry him to his final resting place. He would say a few simple words himself if the preacher was unavailable, his voice low and steady. He was not just an undertaker. He was the town's conscience, its quiet, compassionate strength in the face of unimaginable loss. The men who had once mocked him for his choice of family now looked at him with a deep, humbled awe. He was doing the work that none of them could. The fever broke with the first heavy snow of winter. It had taken a dozen souls, a terrible price. But the town had survived, and in the aftermath, something had profoundly changed. When Caleb, May, and Lydia walked into the general store, a hush still fell, but it was not a silence of condemnation. It was a silence of respect. Mr. Henderson, the storekeeper, nodded to them. "What can I get for you folks?" he asked, his voice quiet. "No charge today. The town, we're grateful." They had not been forgiven because they had done nothing that required forgiveness. They had simply been seen. Their strange, impossible life was no longer a sin to be judged, but a mystery to be respected. They had been tested by a fire far hotter than the one that had destroyed May's first home. And they had not only endured, they had prevailed. They were no longer outcasts. They had become a part of the town's own story of survival, their 3 lives woven inextricably into the fabric of the community. A year passed, the seasons turned, the snows melted, and the valley bloomed with the fierce, vibrant life of a western spring. The town healed, its losses becoming scars that told a story of resilience. The cabin on the hill was no longer a place to be whispered about, but a landmark, a place where life, in its most unconventional form, had taken root and blossomed. That spring, Lydia knew she was pregnant. There was a new softness in her eyes, a new, gentle curve to her belly. The child was a quiet, joyful confirmation of their life, a tangible symbol of their future. One evening, as she and May sat mending clothes by the fire while Caleb carved a piece of wood outside, Lydia looked up. Her needle paused.
"May,"
she said softly,
"I have been thinking about a name. For the baby."
"It's too soon to worry about that," May smiled. "You have months to go."
"No,"
Lydia said, her gaze serious.
"I think the name has been waiting for a long time."
She took a deep breath. "If it is a boy, I would like to name him Elias." May's hands went still in her lap. The name, a ghost she had lived with for so long, spoken aloud in this new life, in this new home. The shock of it stole her breath. She looked at Lydia, at her calm, earnest face, and saw no pity, only a deep, abiding love. It was not a gesture meant to placate or replace. It was a gesture of inclusion, of grafting May's past onto the trunk of their shared future. Tears welled in May's eyes, but for the first time in years, they were not tears of grief. They were tears of a release so profound it felt as though the last of the stones around her heart had finally crumbled to dust.
Lydia,
She whispered, unable to say more. He was the beginning of your story here, Lydia said gently. It is only right that he be the beginning of our new one. She reached out and took May's hand, her touch warm and firm. You are my sister. Your past is my past now, too. The town's spring festival that year was a joyous affair. It was a celebration of survival, of a community that had faced death and chosen life. This time, when Caleb, May, and Lydia walked among the festivities, there were no averted glances, no whispers. There were smiles and nods and shared plates of pie. Jeb, the man Caleb had fought, now a widower, came up to them and clapped Caleb on the shoulder, his eyes full of a quiet, enduring gratitude. Martha, the woman who had called them an abomination, pressed a beautifully stitched baby blanket into Lydia's hands. Her face softened with a hard-won humility. They stood together near the bonfire, Caleb in the middle, his arms around both his partners. May leaned her head on one of his shoulders, Lydia on the other. They held hands, their three forms a single, indisputable unit. One man, two women, a family, not sanctified by law or by church, but by fire, by trial, by sickness, and by a love that had proven stronger than all of it. Caleb looked at May's face, radiant and at peace in the firelight. He looked at Lydia, her hand resting on her swollen belly, her eyes shining with a quiet, powerful joy. His heart was so full it felt as though it might burst. The world had told him to choose, and in the end, he had chosen everything. He had chosen a life larger and more profound than any he had ever dared to imagine. If this is a sin, he thought, pulling them closer, then God has made a beautiful sin. The story ends not there, but a few months later, with the cry of a newborn baby echoing in a sun-drenched cabin. A boy, with Caleb's clear eyes and a tuft of dark hair. He was born into the loving hands of two mothers and a father, in a home that love had built against all odds. His name was Elias, and his first breaths were not of a world of judgment and fear, but of laughter and sunlight and the boundless, open sky of the West. Thank you so much for listening to this story. It's been a journey, and I'm honored you took it with me. I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and let's connect. If you enjoyed this tale, consider subscribing to the From Wild West channel for more stories like this. And don't forget to share your thoughts. Your support means the world